is consequences of the pandemic. Will organized crime take over? And let me please pay your attention to the fact that the topic of the panel is a question, but not a statement. And overall, the discussion panel today is attended by scientists and experts from 5 countries: Canada, Ukraine, the USA, South Africa, and Great Britain. It's a great honor for me to moderate this discussion panel. So let me please introduce our speakers. Антонио Никасо, Canada, a best-selling author, internationally recognized expert on organized crime, author of more than 30 books on criminal organizations. Professor Антонио is a regular consultant to governments and law enforcement agencies around the world. Don Pinnok, South Africa, South African writer, investigative journalist, and photographer, author of 17 books about history, politics, the environment, gangs, and science. Dom Pinnok is a research fellow at the Center of Criminology, University of Cape Town. Oleg Maltsev, Ukraine, author, researcher, criminologist, psychologist, academician of Ukraine Academy of Sciences, founder and the director of the Criminalistics Institute, head of Expeditionary Corps. Dr. Maltsev is an author of numerous books in the areas such as applied history, sociology, psychology, philosophy, criminalistics, and criminology. Alexander Sainchin, Ukraine, Doctor of Law, academician of Ukraine Academy of Sciences, chairman of the Humanitarian Scientific Society. Professor Sainchin is a lawyer, the author of many monographs and scientific works in the fields of criminalistics. Atina Karadzoyani, United Kingdom, professor in media and communication at the University of Leicester. She has an extensive record of publication in disciplinary and cross-disciplinary research outlets. Dr. Karadzoyani has demonstrated success in securing research income from research councils of UK and the European Commission. James Finkenauer, USA, distinguished professor emeritus at Rutgers University, former director at the National Institute of Justice, Washington, D.C. Dr. Finkenauer is an expert in human trafficking, juvenile and international criminal justice. I'm really delighted to be here today, and let me please deliver a few words about the reference terms of this panel. Each speaker holds the opportunity to answer 2 questions formulated and presented to speakers in advance. Please limit the extent of answers up to 7-8 minutes. And the first question is criminalization of society. Criminalization always occurs, self-sufficient organization of people with their own rules, when states manifest failure to cope with extreme situation in the face of global threats. In turn, entities establish on their own without taking into account state interests, and other people tend to become criminalized and or regarded as such. And I give the floor to Professor Antonio Никасо.
So, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on a topic of great concern. As you say, Constantino, mobsters usually try to take advantage of social hardship and economic difficulties. Let's take the example of the Russian mafia, a kind of evolution of the Vori Zakonia. The mafia that we know and study today started with the faulty transition from Soviet planning economy to market economy. The country did not have a system that clearly defined property rights, an effective court system, and a credible police force, which created a demand for private protection. As Federico Varese underlined in his important study on the Russian mafia, the powerful lobby groups that developed after the collapse of the Soviet economic system were successful in obtaining a favored distribution of assets and tax exemption. The imperfect transition from state-run to market economy generated the criminal opportunity, including incentives to acquire steal assets, corrupt officials, evade taxes, illegal export capital, and launder money. Now, something similar happened in Sicily, where the abolition of feudalism and widespread introduction of private property rights generated the fear of losing property and being cheated. As a result, the demand for protection increased. So people trained in the use of violence took advantage of the situation by providing private protection. More precisely, the underworld exploits any economic market that the upper world is unwilling or unable to govern. Fundamentally, mafia and mafia-like organizations seek to play a role similar to a state and regulate the governed, unregulated, and deregulated markets. Now, the next step for mafia-like criminal organization is to provide governance, which means collecting debts, settling business disputes, helping businessmen obtaining special credits, providing protection, and guaranteeing property rights. Criminal protection involves the protection against the competitors or business rivals. That is what distinguishes mafia-like criminal organization from producers and providers of legal and illegal goods and services. The current risk, and I will explain later this aspect in my second intervention, during the time of coronavirus, is that organized crime will take advantage of the lack and delay of state intervention. They are capable to do so because they belong to a class of their own with different goals and strategies, capable to adapt to any situation and to relate to any strata of society, particularly to the elite decision makers. To make way into the legitimate economy, organized crime groups require relationships with officials in the economic and political sphere, thus cultivating a network of opportunity. So this special form of organized crime sees no geographic, legal, economic, or moral boundary. The key to understand how mafia-like criminal groups achieve their level of power, money, and authority is the fact that they are capable of building strategic networks with the people of power and influence. They are lawyers, judges, accountants, brokers, bankers, bureaucrats, politicians, police officers, judges, labor union representatives. Also, mafia and mafia-like criminal groups are less feasible and more business-oriented, more inclined to use corruption than guns.
Thank you, dear Professor. So the discussion can be continued by Don Pinnok.
And I must say it's a great honor to be in the company of such distinguished specialists. So thank you for inviting me. I was challenged by the title of this discussion. It got me to think. My background as a criminologist has been working on gangs, which is very much an urban phenomenon. But for the last probably 5 or 6 years, I've been working on environmental crime, and it was the relationship between those two that got me thinking about how I will approach this issue. And one is crime depends on how you define it rather than the action itself. So it's criminal in terms of the definition, and I say that because we've had about 10 years in the South African system of a criminogenic government. And even the present president, who's trying to fight his way out of that, will admit that in fact, the government, the previous president and people around him have hollowed out the state and state systems in such a way that the airline is about to be grounded. The electricity supply doesn't have enough coal, and we have intermittent electricity. Provincial and local systems are not functioning because much of the money for them has been stolen. Now, I say all of this because if we look at how we come out of this pandemic, we have to understand how we went into it. South African currency, just as the pandemic started, was downgraded to junk status. So our financial system is in trouble. So anything that comes out of this pandemic has to take into account what the country was like when it went into it. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I want to look at really three areas of organized crime. One is, as I've been outlining, that the state itself has been criminogenic. It has bled the country. There are parts of the state that have bled the country dry, and particularly what happened is that the prosecutorial system was hollowed out. And so the ability to undertake action against criminal situations was massively reduced. The police themselves there's a lot of bribery and corruption. So the one side of the issue is the state itself. The second part of that is that I'm particularly involved in, and have been involved for many years in looking at the situation of gangs in Cape Town, but particularly. Now they will, in the way any mafia type organization, they will take advantage of any situation. They are networks of opportunity, as was pointed out earlier, and so they are looking for opportunities, and the degree to which the state is weakened in areas, these organizations, these syndicates will take over. Even now, there are parts of this city, Cape Town, that I live in, where the police will not get out of their vans at night. They are controlled by people with high levels of armaments, and the police will not go in without flak jackets and heavily armed. So what's it going to look like after this pandemic? People are confined to their homes. There's a lot of poverty going on. There's a lot of starvation because most of the people in this country are small. They operate off very small platforms, very small businesses, micro economics. The third area, and it's part of my present interest, is, and it's really across the whole of Africa, but South Africa is very central to that. And that is that the poaching systems across the continent have been decimating wildlife. And most of that goes to Asia, particularly China, Vietnam. And so I've been looking at what that means during the pandemic, during the lockdown. Formal illicit poaching has been locked down, really. And people can't transport ivory, rhino horns, pangolins across distances because they stick out, because everybody is locked down. But what has happened, and it's very deeply concerning, right across Africa, is that communities have lost jobs. They are locked down. They cannot get an income together. And so what they are doing is what's known as bushmeat poaching. They're killing animals, they're penetrating wildlife areas and parks, and they are hunting as their ancestors have done for thousands of years, actually, and they have to survive. So the parks without tourists, and the big problem is tourists provide the revenue that supports the parks. Without that structure in place, it's going to be very difficult to keep wildlife parks and the environment alive. So those are the three areas: the state issue, gangs in the urban areas, and largely in the rural areas, the problem with massive poaching. And let me stop there.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Don Pinnok. So I give the floor to a professor, to academician, who is an author of numerous books about criminology and criminalistics, Dr. Oleg Maltsev.
Спасибо огромное, что дали слово.
Just wait a second, and the interpreter will help Professor Maltsev to translate. So Dr. Maltsev says that he's appreciated for giving him the word on this conference. Just a minute. Kaniki, do you hear us? No, we don't hear. Just wait a minute, please. Some technical issues.
I'm here.
Yes, thank you.
Спасибо огромное, что предоставили слово.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor.
Вчера у нас была очень интересная панель по прогнозированию.
Yesterday we had a very interesting online discussion panel dedicated to prognosis.
И профессор Уэст вчера сравнил пандемию с войной.
And yesterday, Professor Jeffrey West, he had compared this current pandemic with the war.
И мне видится, что это очень интересное и очень такое удобное сравнение для того, чтобы понять последствия.
And for me personally, it seems that this is a very relevant and very convenient term, very convenient comparison in order to understand the consequences of what is going to happen.
Перед нами стоит вопрос, как будет выглядеть общество и криминал в этом обществе после пандемии.
We are faced with a question of how the criminal, what would be the position of criminal in the pandemics and in the post-pandemic world.
После любой мировой войны, наблюдается всегда всплеск преступности.
After any new world war or any local war, we would always see a certain outburst of crime.
Об этом еще писал Никколо Макиавелли в своем трактате о войне.
And this was mentioned by Niccolo Machiavelli in his treatise about war many years ago.
Дело в том, что для того, чтобы понять, как будет выглядеть преступность в обществе после пандемии, нужно понимать, как эта преступность вообще живет, вот до пандемии жила.
And in order to clearly understand what would be the position and what would be the role of criminality in the post-pandemic world, we first have to clearly understand how they are operating, how they were operating before.
Любая преступная организация, неважно, это человек, маленькая группа или большая тайная организация, она привыкла жить в состоянии войны постоянно.
And it has to be said that any type of criminal formation, be it several people, be it a small group or a huge organized criminal group, they were and are, they're always used to live in the state of war.
Общество, наоборот, оно стремится жить в мире.
On the other hand, society is always aiming to live in peace.
И для общества война или пандемия – это катастрофа.
And for the modern society, the war or pandemic is a catastrophe.
А для преступной организации пандемия, катастрофа не имеет значения. Это обычная их жизнь, обычное состояние.
But for the criminality, be it catastrophe or pandemic, this is not something horrible. No, this is their kind of usual way of life.
И когда рушится экономика, рушатся связи глобальные и так далее, на преступную организацию это не влияет никак.
And when the economy crashes, when markets go down, when things just go wrong in countries, it doesn't influence negatively criminal organizations.
И вот мы сейчас видим, что преступные корпорации, они как бы более приспособлены жить в некой кризисной как бы ситуации, нежели как бы обыкновенные общества.
And currently, as we can see from the events that already are unfolding on international arena, we can say that basically the criminal corporations, they are much more experienced or much more capable of surviving better in this world than just usual regular people as we are.
И они владеют огромными капиталами, огромными средствами, и эти средства никаким образом не пострадали от пандемии.
And certainly because of the fact they own just a lot, tons of money, large capitals, their money did not suffer because of the crisis all over.
А большинство предприятий, которые существуют в мире, в Европе, в Соединенных Штатах Америки, достаточно серьезно пострадали финансово в результате этой катастрофы.
And oppositely, most of the enterprises, the legal ones in the US, in Europe, and in other parts of the world, they did suffer drastically during this crisis.
И надо обратить внимание на то, что вот то общество, которое будет пандемии, после пандемии, это общество, где очень многие люди будут нуждаться.
And we have to objectively understand that the society of the post-pandemic world, it is going to be a society which will suffer. It will be in a big and much need for many things.
Да, и им нужно будет выбирать, чем им заниматься после пандемии, потому что многие потеряют работу, многие корпорации развалятся. То есть людям нужно какое-то другое будущее себе создавать.
And most of the people will have to think about what type of future they can build, because so many people are left without jobs, so they will have to think how to survive further on.
И получается, что самыми сильными организациями в постпандемию как раз окажутся криминальные структуры.
And unfortunately, in the post-pandemic world, perhaps we're going to see that the most powerful organizations are going to be criminal ones.
И большинство людей им придется выбирать или вот жить как-то с сильным снижением уровня жизни, относительно которого они привыкли, или связывать как-то свою жизнь с какими-то сильными организациями.
And so I believe that majority of people on this planet, they will have to decide for themselves if they want to keep their lives having a lower quality of life than they were used to, or join and be a part of criminal organizations.
То есть мало того, что у них есть сейчас возможность стать хозяевами огромного числа собственности и так далее и тому подобное, у них сейчас огромное количество людей, которые могли бы попасть в их ряды в силу вот сложившихся обстоятельств.
So, I mean, let alone that currently criminality has a huge opportunity to become an owner of so much property worldwide, they will also have another opportunity to have many more members that would be willing to join them.
То есть преступность не победила, но почва и среда для нее стала наиболее благоприятная сегодня.
I would say that criminality as such did not take over. It didn't win. However, this pandemic period created a better condition for flourishing of criminality.
И для пополнения собственных рядов, и для расширения сферы влияния.
And also, this situation created conditions for them to expand their areas of influence and to have more members.
То есть тенденция такова, что преступные организации, вероятно, станут еще могущественнее, чем они были до пандемии.
So, as I have said, the tendency, as it seems, that criminal organizations are going to be more powerful in post-pandemic period than they were before the pandemic.
А для нормального демократического общества это очень плохой пример. Спасибо за внимание.
And as for any regular democratic society, this is a very bad example. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Oleg Maltsev. And the discussion can be continued by Professor Alexander Sainchin. Please. Alexander Sainchin.
Microphone.
We don't hear you.
Alexander Sainchin.
Слышно меня?
Да. Сейчас да. Отлично.
Ага. Добрый вечер, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen.
Сегодня в Одессе и в Украине была хорошая солнечная погода.
Today in Odessa, in Ukraine, overall, the weather was quite good.
Я очень рад принимать участие в столь представительной и большой конференции, обсуждающей такие глобальные и серьезные мировые проблемы.
I'm very glad to be a part of this conference with such distinguished speakers that are trying to tackle global and very serious issues.
Я бы хотел если можно, ознакомить вас с обстановкой в Украине и в городе Одессе в период карантина.
If possible, I would like to share what have been the conditions in the city of Odessa, Ukraine during the quarantine period.
Нужно отметить, что с марта по сегодняшний день на улицах Украины почти круглосуточно патрулируют 18 тысяч полицейских и нацгвардейцев.
I should say that starting from March till today, on the territory of Ukraine, we have the police patrolling at all times 18,000 policemen.
Уличная преступность, кражи и грабежи фактически подошли к нулевому коэффициенту.
And the street crime, robberies, and other criminal acts are factually coming close to zero. Basically, they're decreasing in Ukraine.
Ощущается, что организованная преступность перешла в интернет-пространство.
And I should tell that organized crime, almost all of it has transferred to the digital sphere.
Если уличная и насильственная преступность резко снизилась, то преступность, которая происходит с использованием интернет-услуг, резко возросла.
Since I've said that the street crime has decreased in the levels, on the other hand, the internet crimes and cyber crimes, they have increased.
Это связано с тем, что граждане Украины перешли на обслуживание в своем большинстве, заказывая любые продукты и сферу обслуживания через средства интернета.
And this tendency is related to the fact that most of the population of Ukraine has switched to making transactions over the internet.
В целом, преступность по характеру общего снизилась в 3 раза.
And criminality as such in general, it has decreased by 3 in general. By 3 times. 3 times.
Однако, наряду с резким снижением такого вида преступности и перехода организованной преступности в интернет-пространство,
however, is the fact that the criminality has decreased and it has basically moved to the cyber sphere.
резко возросла бытовая преступность.
What has increased is the domestic crimes.
Это связано с тем, что граждане находятся в местах своего проживания, более 2 месяцев не общаются фактически с внешним миром. Те группы граждан, которые были склонны к употреблению наркотиков и алкоголя, совершают преступления бытового характера, в том числе и убийства, вот на бытовом уровне.
And the reason why domestic crime has increased is because people are confined in their houses during this quarantine period for more than 2 months. They're not going outside. So people that were usually using drugs and abusing alcoholic drinks are basically committing these crimes and also murders, domestic murders.
Появился новый вид преступности, связанный с нападением на фермеров в ночное время. Идет посевная кампания по уборке урожая, который созрел уже. У фермеров появляются деньги, слабая банковская система обслуживания. Поэтому часть преступного элемента перенесло свое влияние в виде грабежей и разбойных нападений на частные дома фермеров.
And now we see that a new type of criminality is emerging in Ukraine, and they are targeted against farmers. For the reason that farmers currently are having a weak type of banking system because they are collecting crops and doing certain services for people. And so now criminals are targeting private houses of farmers.
Преступность сейчас испытывает такие же сложности, как и все граждане Украины.
I should point out that criminality is having hard times just the way other normal and regular citizens of Ukraine.
На протяжении 3 дней частично в Одессе и в Украине снят карантин.
In the course of last 3 days, partially on the territory of Ukraine and Odessa particularly, the quarantine measures had been a little bit loosened.
Преступность уже отреагировала преступлениями, совершаемые в ночное время, в виде грабежей и разбойных нападений.
And criminality has reacted right away, committing different crimes in the nighttime by robbing people and different places.
Изголодавшаяся, условно говоря, преступность готова совершать в том числе и мелкие преступления в связи с тем, что у них, как и у всех граждан, в настоящее время дефицит наличности.
So the criminality that I would term a starving one in quotation marks are ready now to commit any type of crimes, even the very small crimes, because now they do not have cash.
Правоохранительные органы признают, что жесткие полицейские меры плюс опасность заражения вирусом действительно могли существенно снизить уровень преступности в стране.
Currently, law enforcement is supposing in Ukraine that harsh police measures that were introduced during this quarantine period and a fear of getting infected from coronavirus has decreased the level of criminality in the country.
За последние 3 дня мы наблюдаем резкий всплеск преступности.
However, during the course of this last 3 days, we see the drastic splash of criminality.
В каком виде он дальше будет развиваться, прогнозировать сложно.
At the moment, it's hard to prognose what form it would take from now on.
Пожалуй, все по оперативной обстановке в Украине и в городе.
As for the current situation in Ukraine, this is it.
Да, прошу извинить. Еще меньше стало дорожно-транспортных происшествий, преступлений, совершаемых на почве злоупотребления наркотиками и алкоголя, ну и вот такого вот направления.
And also, I forgot to add that general in the country now we have less traffic-related crimes, less drug abuse-related crimes, and alcoholic consumption crimes.
Thank you, dear Professor. Thank you, dear Professor Alexander Sainchen. And please, the discussion can be continued by Atina Karadziani.
Hi, yes, thank you for inviting me on this panel. I had a few points to make. First of all, to continue from the esteemed colleague that talked about the cybercrime aspect. So we know that we have had like a million related spam, different messages, 800 new malware, 220 more times increase in spam, increase in malicious URLs. We had malicious social media messaging with different variations. For example, business email compromise of saying that the shipment has been postponed and here is the new coordinates or whatever, the new thing, and then you would open it, be some kind of malware. So there's been a lot of COVID-related, hundreds of thousands in certain cases. For example, in India, it has been remarkable. Half a dozen sites that were trying to mimic donation sites for COVID, and also ransomware. So there would be a ransomware that would lock your mobile application and asking you for money to give them money on Bitcoin to unlock it. And so on. So in terms of the cybercrime situation, it is very interesting. But since a colleague spoke a bit about that, I want to move on another area that I think is very interesting. And this has to do with intelligence and how possibly counterintelligence and security works in this specific moment. So I think that it is an understanding that from all governments that you would have threat actors that might try to exploit, or they're already exploiting the intellectual property, specifically to do with medical research. So attacking to steal new sort of information, patents, new ideas, intellectual property to do with scientific developments or emerging vaccines, which is like the search for the vaccine. So it would be actors trying to also because at this particular point, some medical facilities and hospitals and organizations are turning to emergency third-party suppliers. So that is also a concern. For example, the UK government has warned about the possibility of some of these to be criminal, that are not trusted. Also, I think another interesting issue is how sensitive data about the coronavirus or intelligence about how fast it's spreading, how it was discovered, all this kind of stuff becomes some kind of intelligence war between different intelligence agencies. So for instance, there is the famous US-China story now that the Chinese government attempted this disinformation that actually the virus came from the US, and the US disinformation is that no, it is some kind of biological warfare. So there's all these conspiracy theories and intelligence war happen at the same time. It is reminding me actually, although I wasn't alive at that point, but the Cold War story where you know, the KGB was trying to convince that during the World War that the HIV was coming from the US, and you can see sort of now China saying that no, it came from the US, the coronavirus. So there's like this disinformation and cyber psychological operation kind of thing happening that is, I think, very interesting. And also there is an intelligence failure. I mean, fantastic and magnificent in many ways, although tragic intelligence failure at the current White House, because what is going on in the United States and how President Trump was warned repeatedly as early as January by the National Center for Medical Intelligence at Maryland. Coincidentally, that specific center was accused by the KGB that it was where the HIV was developed in the conspiracy story that I already talked about. So they actually warned Trump about the coronavirus, and there were repeated warnings about the coronavirus in January, February, but he chose to ignore it. And also there was, I mean, you could say it's nearly some kind of willful negligence here that has caused many lives. The other issue is about, I think, like stealing secrets, particularly the continuation of the business of stealing secrets. That's what spies do after all. But I mean, now it is important that governments fight to understand and acquire information that is vital for curing the population, having a vaccine, and so on. So you can see that this could be an interesting story. The other thing that I think is interesting is the whole datanomics kind of story, as in if we're entering a fourth artificial intelligence industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, and then you have very specific kind of issues there. Will it reproduce many inequalities in developing countries? That AI revolution, for instance, what this post-capitalist scenario is looking like, and also the problems of surveillance, privacy, data, and national security, and how do you actually employ tracing apps, and those kind of questions that could be something we will be discussing, I think, for a long time. So that's what I wanted to say on this subject. And спасибо.
Thank you, Tina. Спасибо. And I give the floor to James Finkenauer, please. Professor Finkenauer, check the sound. Check the sound, please. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and greetings from normally sunny Florida, although it's raining a little bit today, but normally sunny. I have the advantage of being last here because I've had the opportunity to listen very closely to the prior speakers, which have provided for me an excellent context and foundation for my own remarks and keep me thinking about, what it is that I want to say as I listen to the speakers. Let me start by saying organized crime, writ broadly, normally arises in situations where you have a supply-demand element of the economy. There's some kind of demand for something. That something could be illegal, that something could be something that for some good or service that's in short supply, or it could be for something, for example, as was mentioned, where you have weak government or absent government. You can also have organized crime responding to provide a certain level of security and structure in a governing sort of sense. So as a consequence of this, I see three kinds of criminal organizations that develop out of this sort of context. One of them, and at least two of these have already been mentioned. One of them is a mafia kind of form of organized crime. Mafia really goes into areas where the governmental structure is kind of absent or has weak or has collapsed, and they're providing essentially a governmental structure where none is existing. They're carrying out many of the normal functions that government would carry out, and the citizens in those communities and in those countries become dependent on the mafia to provide those services. And the mafia levies taxes, for example, and does many of the things that government would ordinarily do. But mafia is only one form of organized crime. And where you have organized crime arising in areas where you have some governmental structure, they're usually engaged in other kinds of activities, things where they're not engaged in governing. They're engaged in things like providing illegal services, drugs, for example, gambling, prostitution. They're running extortion rackets. They're doing money laundering and so on. And for these kinds of things, and these are very traditional organized crime activities that have gone on for many years in the US and elsewhere. But there's also a third form of criminal organization that arises, and these I call not organized crime, but crimes that are organized. These are kind of spontaneous criminal networks that arise and respond to criminal opportunities. They don't look like traditional mafias or traditional forms of organized crime. They don't have hierarchical structures. They don't have bosses and underbosses and so on. They have groups of individuals who are criminal entrepreneurs who have certain levels of expertise to exploit particular kinds of criminal opportunities. And let me just give you an example. I was reading about this today in the US. You may know that in response to the unemployment situation in the US Congress has appropriated billions of dollars to pay unemployment benefits to people who have lost their jobs. And so there's a lot of money out there that's been appropriated for this purpose. Well, one of the things that's happening is people, and as far as the investigators know so far, they're in Nigeria, have stolen people's account information, are applying for these unemployment benefits and having the money deposited into their accounts. And the only way that people have become aware of this is that people who are not unemployed, who have not applied for unemployment benefits, are getting a notice that they have received these benefits. So they're going into a separate account. Now, the people who are doing this obviously know how to manipulate, they know how to use the internet, they know how to steal identities, they know how to operate all of those sorts of structures. They don't look anything like traditional mafias or traditional forms of organized crime. Many of the persons in those groups don't have that sort of expertise. The thing also about these particular kinds of criminals is that they will exploit this opportunity, and when that's over, they'll move to something else. And again, it requires a particular level of expertise that traditional forms of organized crime, who are tough guys, thugs, who can employ muscle and so on, they don't know how to do this sort of stuff. They could get someone else to do it for them, but that's not what their traditional criminal activity is engaged in. So what we see right now happening in organized crime is the more traditional forms have gone into decline. Why? Because in a lot of instances, the borders have closed down. So it's very difficult to be trafficking drugs, for example, and trafficking human beings or smuggling. It's not going to last forever, but it happens to be the situation right now. So what do these groups do? They turn to other sorts of things. And it goes back to the issue of US, and I think many other countries as well. If you look at where's the big supply issue right now, it's having to do with things dealing with the virus. We have a shortage of tests in the US. Contrary to what the politicians are saying, there's a shortage of tests in the US. There's a shortage of the personal protective equipment that's required to deal with the virus. We don't have a vaccine, really don't have a vaccine, although there people claim that they have a vaccine. So these are the things that are now either not available at all or in short supply. So who can fulfill those things? Criminal entrepreneurs. They see an opportunity. Do they have the real stuff? No, it's counterfeit. They got counterfeit tests. They got counterfeit treatments. They got counterfeit vaccines, all sorts of stuff so that they can exploit right now this particular criminal opportunity. Will that last forever? No, because hopefully at some point we're going to be able to deal with this virus and things will go back to some more normality. So that particular form of criminal enterprise will no longer exist. But what will exist is people have developed a certain expertise about how to deal with counterfeit materials, how to deal with them on a global sort of level. They will simply shift that focus to something else that's in short supply and in demand and so on. And I think that's one of the most insidious things that we look at as being the legacy of this organized crime problem. New markets will have developed alongside the old markets, which will still exist and will come back to some degree because the world is loosened up now, and those things can now be pursued further. So we'll have whole new criminal enterprises existing alongside of the existing criminal enterprises, including mafias in those places, as I mentioned, where you have weak government, where you have a lack of a civil society. It won't be in the United States. It won't be in most countries in Western Europe, but it'll be in places where there's weakness and where those forms can move in and take over the governmental enterprises. And that'll be the subsequent threat of all of this. That'll be the new markets. Also, they'll be recruiting new people. We got a lot of young people without employment opportunities. There's opportunities there. If you know a little bit, for example, about computers, you can get picked up in one of these cybercrime enterprises. You can make a lot of money in a very short period of time. And I think that's going to be an attraction for young people to get recruited. And I think those are some of the problems, unfortunately, that we have to look to as we move into the future.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Finkenauer. And we finished the discussion of the first question, and we can continue. The second question for the discussion, as you remember, is criminalization ways, how it may take place. What are the new ways of the emergence of organized crime? Is it true that crime is taking over today? And what forms of crime might still appear after post-epidemic period? So please, dear Professor Антонио Никасо, you know much about our future. We believe it.
Okay. We haven't never seen a crisis like this in living memory. So the COVID-19 is having a significant impact on the economy and is influencing and shaping organized crime as well. In other words, when the economy collapses or is in a shutdown, organized crime also suffers. So the lockdown of the public movement and the sealing of borders have had an immediate impact on certain criminal activity, which have since slowed or stopped. Many countries have seen a drop-off in crime, like murders, with some exception. In Mexico, for example, in last March, there have been 2,500 murders. But many countries have seen a drop-off in crimes like murders, extortion, prostitution, illegal betting, human trafficking. Getting migrants across borders have become far more difficult amid increased scrutiny and lack of human activity. But Europol warned that criminals were rearranging people smuggling routes and finding new ways to lure potential victims. With the business closed, there are fewer places for organized crime to conduct business, no pro sport to gamble on, fewer counterfeit goods coming in from China to sell. Drug producers are having trouble getting imports of chemicals from China. Wuhan is known for its production of chemicals, including the ingredients needed to cook fentanyl or other powerful synthetic opioids. And we know that fentanyl was a product of great demand before actually supplying the United States the consumption of heroin. Then there has been an increase in the price of illegal drugs because not only for lower amount of chemicals coming from China. According to the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes, cocaine production has been impacted by COVID-19 crisis as producers, especially in Eastern Colombia, are suffering from a shortage of gasoline, which was previously smuggled from Venezuela and is essential in cocaine production. In many countries, gangs and criminal organizations have watched over specific neighborhoods, telling people to stay indoors, enforcing the quarantine. According to Inside Crime in Venezuela, pro-government armed group known as Colectivos were the ones to announce the very first lockdown measure in certain areas, even before the government or healthcare service. In Mexico and Italy, criminal groups or associates have distributed food of essential items. In Mexico, the daughter of El Chapo is distributing a product with the logo of his father, with the photo of his father on the package. So those are a few examples of the increased type of governance taking advantage of the absence of delays of state intervention. Many criminal organizations have started selling personal protective items, illicit medicine. They try to find a way. For example, in order to sell in drugs, some criminal organizations have infiltrated their men into essential services, such as Uber. Through drivers connected to this important service, it is possible to circumvent the restriction imposed and deliver the drugs at home. We mentioned about another important business is the increase of COVID-19 related phishing scams, whereby cyber criminals have impersonated the trusted source of information, such as the World Health Organization, to spread malware or harvest the personal information. During this period of coronavirus, computer scams in the form of phishing have increased by 600% worldwide. But there will be more opportunity as the crisis unfolds. Emergency funding issued to help the economic fallout of a pandemic is likely to fuel corruption across Europe. Criminals will find the ways to fraudulently apply for aid. I think, as Oleg mentioned, the risk that many companies may fall into the hand of criminals is very high. Just as there is a high risk that some companies may be taken over by mafia or mafia-like criminal organization nominees. They may offer credit to businessmen on the verge of bankruptcy. It is useful to remind that the mafia and mafia-like criminal organization are against the state law, but not against the market law. And so just a few businessmen are willing to refuse money in time of need. In many countries, we know drug money has become the oxygen for the legal economy. Just a few other things. Let's take the sample of my native country. History teaches us that the criminal organizations have always benefited from natural disasters, notably the cholera outbreak in Sicily in 1867, in Naples in 1884, as well as the 1908 earthquake in Reggio Calabria and Messina, the earthquake in Campania and Basilicata in 1980, the earthquake in Emilia-Romagna, Abruzzo, Umbria, and Marche, all provide a profitable opportunity for criminals able to put their hand on the stimulus and reconstruction fund. But don't forget, drug money worth billions of dollars helped some banks avoid bankruptcy during the financial crisis of 2008. This was the only liquid investment capital available at that time. Now, criminals are rapacious, like a vulture, and resilient. They are capable to adapt to any circumstances. An old Sicilian proverb perfectly describes this characteristic. Bend down the rush until the flood has passed. So we must learn from the past, and I believe there is an urgency to introduce emergency measures and to also focus on undocumented workers, on people in need, on families that struggle. The goal is to maintain social cohesion, but the goal is to avoid that the criminal organization to take advantage again of this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Antonio Nikasо. And I give the floor to Don Pinnok, please. Check the sound, please. We don't hear you. Check the sound, please.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
I agree. We need to look backwards to look forwards. And it's very useful in South Africa to do that, because when we moved from an authoritarian regime to a democratic state, things didn't get better in the criminal sense, because transitional situations are always very useful for criminal markets to move in, and they did. We had syndicates moving in from all over the world to South Africa, and they did immense damage at all sorts of levels. At the upper levels, a family called the Guptas, an Indian family, moved in and totally subverted the upper sections of the state and taught senior government officials how to cheat. And they cheated massively. They virtually destroyed this country economically. The other thing that happened is that the drug routes, the heroin drug routes, were, I think, probably getting increasingly blocked going northwards, and they started coming south. So Cape Town particularly became a center of drugs moving east and west, and created all sorts of, massive drug problem in South Africa. Now, looking at those situations and hearing what people are saying, and I'm agreeing with them, we have a situation now where we have one of the hardest lockdowns in the world, I think, complete lockdown. We've just been allowed out for 3 hours a day to do some exercise. But who is on the street are police and army, and they are not very well trained. They've already killed somebody for disobeying them, for standing in his yard drinking a beer when you're not supposed to have alcohol. And what the problem is that there's two routes out of this which are being discussed here at the moment. And one is that we could, the COVID pandemic could be the catalyst for reordering of society, for unblocking log jams, moving towards a greener economy. And there are definite moves to use it for that. But the other alternative is that, and unfortunately it's the more likely alternative, is that the transitional situation being caused by the pandemic is going to increase the possibility for criminal activity, as we've been hearing here today. And that will lead to increasing police pressure and a more authoritarian state. And we're seeing that starting to develop already. Bizarre situations. In the exercise period, somebody was arrested for standing still because he wasn't exercising. You know, it's a small issue, but it's a synecdoche for a much bigger issue here, where the police and army and actually the Minister of Police is saying publicly things like, you know, the level of policing now is what we want in the future South Africa. It's very efficient. So there are real concerns now of a deepening of crime and a deepening of authoritarianism and a conflict starting to develop between two sides, with the public in the middle being the losers.
Thank you, Don Pinnock. And the discussion can be continued by Dr. Oleg Maltsev, please.
Спасибо, что дали слово.
Thank you for giving me the word.
Когда мы говорим о том, каким будет новый криминал после пандемии,
when we speak about how would new criminal would look like after the pandemics,
нам нужно как бы задаться вопросом, что мы вообще подразумеваем под криминалом.
We have to first ask the question to ourselves, what do we mean when we say criminality or organized crime?
То есть как бы криминал — это очень широкое понятие.
Because criminality as such is a very wide notion.
Да, то есть отчаявшегося человека на улице, который ограбил кого-то, никогда до этого не совершая преступления, мы ведь тоже причисляем к криминалу.
Because just to give a simple example, a person who is in a despair and committed a criminal act for the first time in his life somewhere outside, we would label him as a criminal, right?
И я когда, в общем-то, думал о том, как делать доклад на конференции, я себя спрашивал, о какой части криминала как бы говорить.
And when I was preparing for this online panel discussion, I asked myself a question about what kind of criminality I would be speaking about.
Я являюсь поклонником Дона Пиннока, как бы, и для меня, например, Антонио Никасо, который выступал, это вообще, ну, как бы первое лицо в области криминологии, как бы, в мире, и я считаю, что они абсолютно правы, когда они говорят в общем о тенденции.
So I deeply respect Don Pinnock as a professional, and Antonio Nikasо for me is #1 person in the world when it comes to criminology. And I do totally agree with what these two people have said about the tendency when it comes to criminality right now.
Поэтому давайте посмотрим как бы на криминал как на трехэтажную конструкцию.
Thus, coming from this, I would suggest that we would take a look at the criminality to divide it into 3-level construction.
Да, то есть то, о чем говорят определенные спикеры, как бы касается некой уличной преступности, которая всегда существовала и всегда будет как бы существовать в той или иной форме. И здесь действительно сила государства имеет какое-то значение.
So what was mentioned several times by some of the speakers certainly relates to street crimes, which was and is like everywhere and probably will be at all times with us.
Когда мы говорим об организованной преступности, о тайных организациях, то для них государство никогда не являлось никакой помехой, многим из них по 400-500 лет.
But when we speak about organized criminal organizations, particularly about secret societies that are criminal, they do not care what is happening in the state. What kind of state is it? Is it powerful or not? Because they have been existing for 300, even 400 years.
Да, то есть, по сути своей, представьте себе организацию, которая выжила 400 лет. Как бы, тогда еще многих государств не существовало.
If we imagine, for instance, an organization that survived in the course of 400 years, that's a very long lifespan. I mean, a lot of states even did not exist at that time when they were emerging.
Представьте себе, какое государство может оказать влияние на такую структуру.
And imagine, just suppose, what kind of government can actually impact that type of organization?
Я много раз задавался вопросом, как в центре Европы может существовать самая могущественная криминальная структура в мире в демократическом обществе, и никогда не находил ответа на этот вопрос.
Possible that, and I have asked myself a question many times, how it is possible that in a democratic modern Europe, in the heart of Europe, we would have a criminal organization that is living and doing their things quite successfully. How is that possible?
То есть, вы понимаете, это не просто организация, это государство в государствах.
As you'd understand, this is not only an organization, this is like a state inside of the state.
Когда мы будем говорить о третьем этаже, это само государство.
And when we speak about the third level of this construction that I've mentioned before in the beginning, it is the state itself, the government.
Знаете, у нас есть такая шутка, что криминология изучает преступников-неудачников.
We have a joke as follows, that criminology studies the criminals that are losers or the ones that are unsuccessfully doing their job.
Да, а наука, которая изучает успешных преступников, называется политология.
And the science that studies successful delinquents or criminals is called political science.
Да, поэтому когда мы говорим, как изменится криминал, о каком уровне этого криминала идет речь?
So when we speak about how criminality will change in the post-pandemic period, we have to understand about what kind of criminality we are speaking about.
Безусловно, пандемия создала огромный силовой компонент, который эти организации будут реализовывать в своих интересах.
Certainly, pandemic has created a very powerful component, the power component, which is going to be exploited by criminality.
То есть любая подобная криминальная структура, которая выжила 400 лет, она имеет огромные преимущества перед любыми формами капитала в настоящий момент в экономике.
So any type of organization that was capable of surviving for 400 years would be always advantageous despite any type of capital or any type of institutions.
Поэтому подобные структуры, они они привыкли работать в этих условиях.
So consequently, this type of structures, they are used to operate in such type of conditions.
И по сути своей, вот как я говорю, основной формой криминала, которая будет сегодня, это втягивание классического бизнеса, классического криминала, прошу прощения, классического капитала в преступную деятельность.
So I think that the main form of criminal that would emerge is the one that would be transforming, trying to basically pull the capital into the criminal area.
То есть, по сути своей, пандемия создала для всех состояние нужды. То есть все нуждаются, и простые люди, и бизнесмены сегодня.
So basically, the pandemic environment, this condition, it created a situation when everybody is in need. Everybody.
Да, я думаю, что многие бизнесмены даже какое-то время не будут понимать, с кем они сотрудничают.
And I think for a while, a lot of businessmen, it would be hard for them to understand with whom they are cooperating.
Да, то есть по сути своей всем, кому нужна помощь, она будет оказана.
And certainly, in a nutshell, anybody who needs an assistance or help, they will receive that help.
Но приняв эту помощь, обратной дороги уже не будет.
But once they accept that help, they will be not able to leave the journey that they have started. There's no exit from that situation.
Безусловно, будет ретрансформироваться современная система как бы преступности, потому что, как вы понимаете, даже сейчас в пандемию, как заметил один из наших коллег, как бы, то есть, по сути, люди сидят дома, ворам нечем заняться.
And certainly, I believe that modern ways of committing criminal acts is going to transform as well. Because as one of our colleagues did mention that a lot of criminals are now on lockdown, they have nothing to do, nothing to engage themselves with.
Думаю, что криминал пойдет по пути создания бескарантинных зон частных.
Also, I believe that the crime will tend to create private, non-quarantine zones.
Думаю, что возникнет новая волна электронной преступности.
I believe there will be a new wave of cybercrime that we haven't seen before.
Увеличится телефонная преступность, то есть все виды мошенничества, связанные с телефонией.
All kinds of frauds that are related to the phone calls will be increasing.
Возникнет новые формы горного бизнеса.
I believe there will be new forms emerging that would be related to gambling.
Безусловно, криминального.
Certainly illegal gambling.
И в результате, в общем-то, мы как бы получим некие новые как бы формы преступности, то есть ретрансформированные старые формы преступности.
So as a result, we'll end up having new forms of criminality that are just old criminal ways, but transformed in the ones that became different.
И я думаю, что самая большая проблема как раз существует даже не в самой организованной преступности, а в том, что очень много людей попытались эту пандемию использовать в своих интересах.
And I think also a big problem is that a lot of people attempted and are attempting to use this pandemics in their own egoistical aims, and the problem is in that and not that much in organized crime.
И, в общем-то, у очень многих людей это получилось.
And a lot of people did succeed in doing so.
Ну а у тех, у кого получилось, им это может понравиться.
And the ones that did succeed, they may get used to this. They may like this, to put it simply.
И мы можем получить искусственные пандемии как бы как инструменты маркетинга впоследствии.
And in the future, it is possible that we may end up with having new pandemics that are artificially created.
Спасибо огромное за внимание.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Maltsev. And the discussion can be continued by Professor Alexander Sainchin, please.
Спасибо. Меня слышно?
Да.
Спасибо за предоставленное слово. Уважаемые господа, я абсолютно солидарен с профессорами Антонио Никасо и Олегом Мальцевым, которые являются очень крупными специалистами в области организованной преступности.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I should tell that I completely agree with Professor Antonio Nikasо and Professor Oleg Maltsev. These people are, both of them are very, grand professional and experts in the field of organized crime.
Столь представительная конференция даст нам возможность посмотреть, как в различных странах мира преступность отреагировала на пандемию.
This kind of conference will allow us to understand how criminality did react in different parts of the world.
Нужно отметить, что пандемия в мире показала либо слабое медицинское медицину, либо совершенно разрушенный, как у нас в Украине, уровень медицинского обслуживания населения, в том числе и противовирусного.
I believe that this pandemic has shown that there are certain weaknesses in the medical sphere of many countries. So if the situation is as such, then the pandemic even eliminated and showed it even clearer. When it comes to the situation of Ukraine, this pandemic situation has demonstrated that in Ukraine we have a very, very low level of medical assistance of population and very low and very bad situation when it comes to virology studies.
Многие страны будут вынуждены перенести свои финансовые усилия на совершенствование системы здравоохранения.
Many countries will have to allocate their main attention to the medical health insurance field.
Нам кажется, что и преступность таким образом отреагирует, мониторя, каким образом финансовые потоки будут проходить через соответствующие подразделения медицинского обслуживания.
So, and we have to understand how this financial different currents are going to be allocated to different departments of establishment.
Прежде всего, мне кажется, это будет связано с заменой медтехники и с закупкой новых медпрепаратов.
So first of all, I'm sure that the medical equipment is going to be bought and medical pills, I mean medicine is going to be bought as well in the large amounts.
Я думаю, нужно согласиться с профессором Мальцевым о том, что общая уголовная преступность, она быстро приспособится к пополнению своих финансов за период пандемии.
I think we have to, I agree with Dr. Maltsev that criminality is going to adjust very quickly when it comes to basically replenishing their financial situation and assets.
Давайте к концу лета опять в таком формате пообщаемся и посмотрим, каким образом организованная преступность отреагировала на эти.
I would suggest that we can meet again at the end of the summer, for instance, and discuss and see how did organized crime react to the situation.
Мне кажется, что ближе к осени организованная преступность предоставит нам другие, совершенные более формы хищений.
I believe that in the early fall, we are going to see more sophisticated ways of how organized crime is doing their job.
Спасибо, буду рад пообщаться с вами.
Thank you. I would be very glad to speak with you all.
Thank you, Professor Sainchin. And please, Atina Kradzayani, you will be next.
Thank you, Constantino. So yeah, I've been thinking about this. So what the futures of criminality. I think perhaps it would be an idea to think about what the futures might be to begin with. So I'll be thinking about that. And so there is a general one about, I think, socialism or barbarism. This has been doing the rounds as an idea. I think right now we have some form of, in a way, state capitalism. Like a lot of the response has been that the state is supported, subsidizing workers, keeps the market functioning. You know, this kind of idea of keeping the things ticking for a short period while we get out of it. So this is where we are now. However, if the crisis deepens, let's say in October, November, we have a massive wave of deaths and so on, we might descend into some form in some countries of barbarism, where we have the inability of the state to continue, the business are failing, workers are starving, people are dying, so you have this devastation kind of story, and this could have mass austerity. You have the collapse of services, the whole thing that comes with that. So in that case, then you will witness incredible levels of criminality, because people, if this massive austerity, you will have these reactions of actually even going into houses or in any sort of way to keep themselves from starving. So that's the kind of like called the collapse, the barbarism scenario. Then you have other more sort of radical, for example, from the state capitalism where we are now. Then you have the idea of state socialism, that we go back into a scenario where the banks, the transport, everything gets nationalized and so on. So you have like this big state scenario, big welfare. So the state sort of socialism scenario, it means that possibly you might have other types of criminality that you have in a state socialist scenario of who gains benefit. It might be smaller group of peoples, it might be corruption or bureaucracy or certain kind of jobs that create certain kind of new criminality, for instance. And then finally, I mean, you might have a future that sees lower levels of criminality in the long term if we opt for the growth and slower economy, if we realize that unless we look at this COVID and the environmental problem, the ecological problem we have, and build some kind of bigger society with sort of more on the idea of mutual aid and support and slower growth and like shift in the way, have a mental shift in the way we understand how the world and society should happen, like in a more kind of in a different kind of way, where we don't base everything on exchange value and the market basically this whole ideology of neoliberalism, where the market delivers the good quality of life, and there might be a disruption, but then the market is going to come back and return to normal, and everything's going to be okay. If we get out of that mentality of the resources, that resources are used to maximize profit, exchange, and money, and we use it to maximize life and how we live life and on this planet and how we take care of this planet. I think there is this shift from maximizing profit to maximizing life that I think eventually might even produce less criminality and happier people. So that's more of a utopian take on this one. So this is what my intervention was. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina Graziani. And I give the floor to James Finkenauer, please.
Well, thank you again. And again, I'm thinking and listening, and it's a very, very interesting discussion. Back to the point I was making earlier about the supply and demand and how organized crime fits in that. We have a very good historical example here in the U.S. from Prohibition. Back in the 1920s, there were organized criminal groups, but they were kind of loosely organized and not very sophisticated and so on. But then we had the passage of Prohibition, prohibiting alcohol and the consumption of alcohol. which did nothing to diminish the demand for alcohol. It was the supply of alcohol that was going to be dealt with, and the demand, of course, didn't disappear. So all of a sudden, there was a market opportunity for criminal groups to arise and take advantage of that. And so those smaller criminal gangs and criminal groups became much better organized and much more sophisticated. And even when prohibition ended, they simply then were able to move on into other criminal markets. And I see, you know, as like Santillana said, we should learn from history. If we look at those kinds of things, we can see, okay, that history is likely to be replicated, and these criminal markets will get continued into the future, even though the particular thing that's being marketed may change. If we look, for example, at what's happening with human smuggling and human trafficking, because the borders have been not completely closed down, but made much more difficult, we see now it is much more difficult to move people across these borders. Whereas before, let's say go back prior to the Trump administration, we had coyotes operating out of Mexico that would move people across the Mexican border into the US to take jobs in the US. Now the borders have become much tougher. That doesn't mean that the supply-demand equation has changed at all. There's still plenty of people in Central America and in Mexico that want to come into the US and get jobs in the US. And there are plenty of people in the US who want to give those people jobs. They're farmers. They're people who are looking for domestic employees. They're people who are looking for, in various factories and so on, to hire these people to work. So the demand supply thing has not changed. What has changed is making it tougher to move the people meant that the amateurs, the less sophisticated traffickers, have been forced out of business. Who then takes over that business? The more sophisticated criminal organizations, the ones who can take the higher risk, who have more connections, who have more ability to corrupt governments and so on. They're the ones that move in to take over that smuggling business. That is not going to go away. That is going to be, once they're locked into those areas, and that's a big money-making thing for them, I can see that continuing. Interestingly, one of the biggest areas in criminology that's of concern now in the US, not organized crime and not street crime, it's what's going on in jails and prisons here in the US. There's been a big impact because we got closed spaces, we got absent healthcare, we got lack of services from the outset. And back to the issue of migrants, the detention centers and the shelters where these migrants are being held are enormous health hazards in terms of what's happening to the people in them. So there's this whole issue about how to deal with those people, one of the things being to release them. And interestingly, I was just reading a report not too long ago that in Italy, mafia figures, almost all of them old men, 70s, 80s, 90 years old, are being released from prison because the prisons are crowded and because of the threat to their health, because they're old and they're vulnerable and so on. But there's a great outcry in terms of releasing these people because they're serious criminals. They committed serious crimes, murders, etc. And now they're being released and people are objecting to that. Same thing is happening in the US. That there's an argument on one side, people should be being released from prison because they're health hazards from keeping them in prison. On the other hand, do they present a threat when they get out of prison, or they've not been punished enough and therefore they shouldn't be getting out of prison? So what should we be doing with them? And we haven't solved that problem. We've let out a few of white collar criminals because we figure they're not violent, they're not a threat, so those people can get out. Of course, the poor ones, the ones who are in the worst situations, they don't get released from prison. I think, to repeat something I said earlier, that my biggest concern about the long-term consequence of all of this is going to be a greater acceptance and tolerance of organized criminality, because the demand will be there. A demand for counterfeit goods, a demand for the kinds of things that organized crime can step in and provide. And as long as that's going to be the case, then there's money to be made. There are criminal entrepreneurs who are going to step into those situations to make money out of them. And society will become more tolerant. And as soon as and as they become more tolerant, it becomes less likely that you can get rid of them, that you can root that kind of crime out of the society because it becomes more and more a part of the society. And I think that's what's going to be the biggest danger of all this.
Let me thank to all speakers, dear colleagues and experts. Overall, it's high time we have finished the online panel. Soon after the conference, organizational matters such as text reports, video reports, and online discussion panels will be published on the conference website on May 22nd. Furthermore, a conference collection volume will be published within 2 weeks period, and that brochure will be available to those who are interested. By this, thank you so much for your kind attention and participation, and see you soon.
Thank you, Konstantin.
Thank you, dear Professor Антонио Никасо. Thank you, Don Pinnok, Atina. Thank you. Bye-bye.